Good evening, good afternoon, possibly even good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the final Lacan in Scotland of the academic year. After tonight, we'll break for the summer period and then we'll be back in September. And for our final event of the year, it's an absolute delight to have Carol Owens with us. It sometimes feels like the Lacanian world is one big family, but with Carol in particular, it feels like a family. I've known Carol for a long time. Carol published the second article I ever published. We have a long history and friendship. And I always feel Lacan in Scotland is all about a friendship in the community. So it feels really special to have Carol with us tonight for her first, but hopefully not last, Lacan in Scotland appearance. Carol has published extensively, as I imagine you all know, her own work, and particularly interesting work on younger people, which is in part which she's going to be talking about tonight. But also Carol edits the Lacan seminar series for Routledge, which is a fantastic and growing series, which if you're not aware of, I would definitely recommend you plug into. But for tonight, Carol's going to be talking to us about adolescence. And I, for one, having just spent the last 4 hours at a fun fair with a bunch of 12-year-olds, am really interested to hear about adolescence and how we can begin to understand them. Carol, welcome to Lacan in Scotland.
Thank you, Calum. And it's lovely, sort of, to be here. I say that because I've just been whining about how uncomfortable I feel on Zoom still after all these years. I so much prefer talking in front of people. So please, if you feel like it, would you maybe switch your cameras on so that I don't feel quite so awkward up here? Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That's lovely. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about some of my clinical work with adolescents, and I am going to comment on, I suppose, the thing that's really grabbed my attention over the last couple of years especially, but how particular sort of symptoms, but also ways of being and ways of speaking about adolescence really seem to dovetail with what I feel I know about the concept of the liminal. So I want to talk about that. I'll also talk about how I use Lacan's note on the child, which is a really amazing, very short little piece with it's just oozing with useful things. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to sort of wrap it all together, and hopefully it will make sense. And yeah, I'm not sure if I'll have some profound advice for Calum and his 12-year-olds, but who knows? We'll see. So I'm mainly going to read, but I will at times perhaps stop myself and be a little bit more informal. I'll see how I go. So the title then is Psychoanalysis with Adolescents, Liminal Creatures in a Changing World. So the first section is Betwixt and Between. So the concept of the liminal was first used in 1909 by the ethnographer Arnold van Gennep in his book, The Rites of Passage. And this was he was trying to describe a subjective transition from one social state to another, and also to try to identify patterns and forms associated with phases of transition. So the liminal phase, he argued, corresponded to a period during which the subject experiences ambiguity and inherent uncertainty with regard to identity. In fact, the transition or liminal phase for Van Gennep is the period between stages during which one has left one place or state but has not yet entered or joined the next. However, it was the British anthropologist Victor Turner who is attributed with the discovery of the significance and relevance of Van Gennep's work, and with the elaboration of the notion and implications of liminality in social research. It was Victor Turner who famously regarded the liminal subject as, quotes, betwixt and between. More recently, British critical psychologist, an old friend of mine, Paul Stenner, did an excellent book on the liminal, where he emphasized the liminal experience as occurring during occasions of significant transition, passage, or disruption. And if you're interested in some of these names, I can easily make them available to Calum and Amanda later on. So my interest in borrowing the concept of the liminal from these other related fields of theory and research is because it seems to me to capture extraordinarily well something of the experience of this betwixt and between that I hear about in working with adolescents, where disruption, change, transition, and becoming are all key signifiers. If we consider that liminal experiences are times of psychical disruption, interruption, and transition at the level of identity, and also responses to the destitution or disarray that accompanies an exit from a psychosocial position, then adolescence would appear to be a time of liminality par excellence. However, like any other speaking being, the adolescent as liminal being exists within a complex network of familial and socio-political and cultural relationships. As such, a further element of the liminal as it operates on the adolescent speaking being concerns what changes at the level of the social bond and how that affects their subjectivity. So in the Irish clinical setting, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, the contemporary adolescent inhabits an Ireland where divorce, abortion, and marriage equality are relatively new social facts. What this means is that 21st century Ireland's adolescents, what is usually referred to as Generation Z or Gen Z, are the first generation in Ireland as a generation to have parents who are divorced and to have new hybrid family structures, to have had or to know somebody who has had a legal abortion, or to have legally married gay parents or legally married older gay siblings. Now, more broadly speaking, we can also say that thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, 21st century adolescents have experienced an unprecedented interruption in what we could call or think of as the normal workings of the symbolic order. The prolonged absences from schools, colleges, and university, and even the workplace, these are the banal places of the symbolic in the times of adolescence. These, together with the loss of the symbolic and imaginary coordinates specified by these places, have introduced new complexities in a time already marked by the doldrums of the liminal and its correlates with singularity. Now, for some time in my work with adolescents, I've been noticing how the symptom and its expression indicates a specifically liminal dimension, and how the symptom in that case may be said to perform a knotting of singularity and liminality in relation to the social bond or symbolic order of which the adolescent speaking being is an inhabitant. From a psychosocial point of view, adolescents are beings in transition, beings in becoming, betwixt and between childhood and adulthood. At the same time, the very time of adolescence is said to be expanding. So depending on which resource you consult, adolescence currently starts around 9 years of age and extends to 25 and even beyond. As researchers and clinicians of the social bond, we know that the capacity of a category to change shape, expand, and/or contract is an index of its socio-political and discursive constitution. As with the category of childhood, the invention of adolescence to denote a discrete time in the lifespan of a human being is always conditioned by and indexed upon the way that human youth is figured in a given time and location. It is, though, worthy of our interest as psychoanalysts and theorists of the psychosocial to consider what this pushing out of the borders of adolescence is about, especially now, in a period characterized by neoliberal ideologies, serving and twinned with the ideals of capitalism, both at the level of the social bond and for the lived subjectivity of young speaking beings. In a chapter that we wrote together recently for a book on the precarities of childhood, Jameson Webster and myself looked at adolescence from both sides now. And this is our little nod to Joni Mitchell's lovely song of the Liminal. And there we speculated, first of all, on the relatively new social grouping of the tweenies, the pre-adolescents. We argued that, in Lacanian terms, this group is what we can think of as an S2, the product of pseudo-scientific knowledge, conditioned by capitalism as a product which simultaneously consumes. As a group, it is identified as enjoying a push to adolescence. At the other extreme, on the other side of adolescence, the cohort of young people previously thought to be all grown up by 19 or 20 are now revealed in their 20s as late-stage adolescents. If the tweenies are regarded as new consumers, the older group is often regarded as reluctant consumers. They stay at home for longer, delaying separation from their parents and hometowns, and they appear to reject the outward traditional signs of adulthood, so cars and houses, serious intimate relationships, marriage, babies, dogs and cats, and so on. So, in what follows, I will first of all look at some of the ways I see or understand how young people are managing their experiences of the liminal. And as we're going to see, this sometimes involves installing limits in it. Next, I'm going to look at some of the trouble with the tendency to glorify the liminal and those effects on the adolescent imaginary. After that, I'm going to focus on the other side of adolescence, a time that I think of as a tarrying in the liminal. And then finally, I'm going to reflect on how I find Lacan's insights in his Note of the Child useful in thinking about and working with adolescents. Taking each of the two key principles in his note in turn, I'll explore first of all how we can consider the adolescent symptom being in the place of what is not working out in the parental couple. Then I'm going to look to the second principle for what of the mother's fantasy can be considered to be in play in constituting the young person's symptom. But in each exploration, I try to keep one eye on the liminal aspect of adolescent subjectivities and the other eye on the changing aspects of a young person's lived reality and conditions, or how these experiences are brought to bear on what is already unstable and changing at the core of their existence. So, managing the liminal. A boy is struggling with anxiety about the leaving cert. The leaving cert, or leaving certificate, is the final set of examinations a secondary school student sits ahead of going to university in Ireland. It looms large and terrifying for most 17 and 18-year-olds, since their final results determine which college course they will end up taking at third level. In fact, it begins next Wednesday and it goes on for about 3 weeks. And I have a number of clients involved in the leaving cert, so it's going to be tough for all of us. The boy I mentioned worries that he won't be able to study enough to do well as he needs to, in order to get into college and succeed. He struggles so much with getting his homework done that his mother has to sit beside him and help him to stay focused. The thing is, this boy is just 12 years old at the moment. The mother doesn't understand why he worries so much when the leaving is so far away. And by the way, that is how we talk about it here in Ireland. It's just called the leaving. When I ask him about all of this worrying, he tells me that he didn't know the leaving existed until a teacher asked his class if anybody had older sisters or brothers doing it. And then he started to tell me about all the other things he has been worrying about. Santa Claus, for one thing. He cannot believe that he believed in Santa for so long. And when he discovered that his parents had been pretending to him, he felt devastated. This was just 2 years ago when he was 10. Not long after that, his mother explained to him that he was going to have a third baby brother, and also told him how babies were made. So in the space of just a few months, this young boy's entire existence was foreshortened into an ordering of time projected along a trajectory of the limits, or the literal, of his childhood. On the one hand, Santa doesn't exist, and the sexual relationship, the impossible real of sex, intrudes. And on the other hand, the upper limit of this time is designated by a signifier, leaving. His worrying had led to the development of an orthorexic style eating practice that insists on the features of regularity and consistency. He can only eat every 4 hours exactly. The amounts he eats are carefully measured, and what he eats must be carefully monitored as healthy for his age. He looks at websites for nutrition advice for what 12-year-old boys should be eating. So we could say that when it comes to his adolescence and what is experienced as an unbearable liminality, he has devised an eating system as a way to reduce the years to 4-hour slots and as a way to concentrate on the here and now of his existence. Danish sociologist Bjorn Thomason argues that the point of departure for any analysis of liminality should be the passage experiences themselves. Now, in this regard, we have the perfect case study possibility in Ireland with what is called transition year, a year at secondary school that sits between the junior and the senior academic programs. I imagine for the UK, that's a bit like something in between the GCSEs and the A-levels, a whole other year of schooling, which doesn't pertain to one or the other. This year may be seen as a culturally sanctioned period of time during adolescence, which appears to celebrate but also designate the passage from one time in adolescence to another. Transition year has become increasingly the norm in Ireland, although once it was exclusively an option for schools in affluent areas or private schools, operating as a kind of extramural year where students can explore non-academic subjects and gain work experience. But nowadays, it's practically ubiquitous. As anybody working with adolescents in Ireland will attest to, a good number of adolescents show up for therapy during transition year. Some complaining of deathly boredom, others finding themselves at sea in a simmering cauldron of imaginary rivalries and toxic envy. So there are structural tendencies that make of this year a salient disruption or interruption of adolescence for some young people. But for others, it dovetails with an existential drama overladen with this particular signifier of change. The weight, however, of what can often act as an imperative to transition can foment any number of solutions intended to halt or delimit this passage through time. A girl came to see me in the middle of what she called a rubbish transition year. The school she attends had not managed to organise anything of interest, and she and most of her classmates turned up day after day for what felt like an eternity of unstructured boredom. She presented with a vomiting phobia. She had started to limit what she eats for fear of vomiting, restricting herself to simple, uncomplicated, easily digestible things which she said could not possibly make her feel sick. I asked her about the things that make her feel sick. She then told me about all the places in her life where there are no limits. She said, for example, she shares a bedroom with a messy younger sister who throws her clothes all over the floor and throws things all over both of their beds. Her brother fills the entire house with loud, aggressive music, and her mother interrupts moments of reverie and solitude with an uncontainable, and she says, possibly menopausal, moodiness and irritability. Limiting herself to the attempt to digest only those things that do not make her feel sick is at the same time the symptomatic expression of managing the pressure to transition from one stage of her adolescence to another. A 15-year-old girl in transition year turned to me after her parents had left the room during our first meeting, and she said, I should have been a boy. Now, for this young person, transition year will revolve around her desire to be recognized by her parents as trans. Our work will involve this desire becoming articulated with each parent and working through what it means for each one of them. The mother and father disagree with each other over the gender identity of their child. They say to me, "She used to be so girly. I know she was always a tomboy," and so on. I'm very interested in this exchange of signifiers and fantasies in and through which their daughter's gender identity doesn't quite work out, but which is phantasmatically charged with each one of their idea about what makes girls and what makes boys. In the sessions, she works through the idea that her parents will have to mourn the loss of the girl that she is not managing and has not managed to be. But we arrive at the idea that they would have to do that anyway, and not just because she might prefer to be trans or a boy. Our work draws to a close when they are satisfied that their parents are willing to put their fantasies on hold, those that have been so charged with libidinal investment that they left no place for their daughter's own fantasies of who or what they can be. So for this person, the signifier trans traces out the subversion of their place as an object in their parents' fantasy. So now I'm going to look at this glorification of the liminal and the kind of problems and indicators I think this has for the adolescent imaginary. Liminality is quite often glorified in our time, which adopts a celebratory attitude towards anything that presents repeated opportunities for novelty and constant innovation. In fact, since Turner first coined the phrase, the term liminality is often sketched as an emancipatory tool or ideal, and especially so in neoliberal capitalist ideology. In our time, neoliberal capitalism supports the production of what Bauman calls liquid modernity, an exalted state of liminal existence, where perpetual movement and endless self-discovery are celebrated and glorified. In this way, the glorification of the liminal can operate so as to create the conditions for an interminable stay for the adolescent-speaking being in what is supposed to be a strictly temporary transitional location. This extended stay is authenticated alongside the promotion of a set of ideals of permanent liquidity at the level of identity. So in fact, the liminal experience of adolescence itself undergoes a stretching and elaboration predicated upon the ideological value attached to deferral of destiny, of identity, of status, with transition, impermanence, and change taking on the properties of long-stay positions instead of passage experiences. And then there is the industry of self-invention, on the other hand, with 1,000 Instagram stories and TikTok videos waiting to be posted. Rollo Strenger's work in The Designated Self from 2005 comes to mind in this regard, as it calls attention to the cultural imperative at work in the shaping of young people's lives. And he argued that identity formation for these groups is perpetual experiment. In a chapter that I wrote for a book on the drive with Stephanie Swales, if she's there, I think the book is published just around now. Anyway, Stephanie and I argue that postmodern liminal creatures have a correlative new ego ideal, which is indexed upon the destination of a ceaseless reinvention and the possibility of an endless source of existential guilt for never succeeding and never arriving at this destination. As such, the promotion of competing ideals under neoliberalism fostering the endless consumption of objects in the quest for identity production, crafts an interminable range of proxy possibilities for drive satisfaction, and at the same time perpetuates an ideology of ceaseless or permanent liminality. Neoliberal discourse encourages us to hone the personality characteristics, skills, and talents that will unlock the happiness promised by the wealth of opportunities available in capitalist society. And we can see this very keenly with the ways that Gen Z are currently targeted by industry, as well as with the forging of new careers, such as the adolescent social media influencer. Commenting on representations of femininity on social media, Susie Orbach found cosmetic surgery apps aimed at girls as young as 6 years old, promising to forever transform them. But we can add to that various trends in beauty, fashion, diet, and the food industries. So let's look at tarrying in the liminal, what that might be about. Many young people come into psychoanalytic work with complaints around or about the pressure to passage, to transition, to mature, to grow up, and often with a sense of dread and danger of leaving one state of being or identity for another. So for them, unlike the group of young people who have come to be described as tweenies, it is the exit from childhood which stages an identity disruption resulting in trauma, anxiety, and symptom formation. For these older adolescents, it is the exit from adolescence into so-called adulthood that causes the problem. Discussions about so-called extended adolescence often point up and mark out the idea that, first of all, there's nothing new in that. There's always been plenty of historical evidence to show how young people up to and beyond age 25 have in previous times not necessarily been in any great hurry to move along to adulthood. Other commentaries point out that socioeconomic conditions have changed such that the opportunities for young people to grow up and move on are diminished. And in fact, a recent report from the EU agency Eurofound showed that the number of Irish people aged 25 to 29 living with their parents grew at one of the highest rates in Europe between 2007 and 2017. Broadly speaking, sociological, psychosocial, and queer or deconstructionist treatments of adolescence regard the phenomenon of late-stage adolescence as a response to market conditions, changes in educational opportunities, inflating property rental rates, and/or the law. But what typically remains under-examined in much research on late-stage adolescence is the question of how the very ideals produced under neoliberalism's quest for endless self-invention and deferral of identity formation play out in adolescence at the level of the singular, in suffering and being, and moreover lead to what I'm going to call a tarrying in the liminal. Indeed, these so-called new symptoms associated with the social bond under neoliberalist capitalism can be thought of as shortcuts to jouissance, often involving the body and the imaginary relationship with the small other. And I would say that the Lacan jouissance is especially pertinent in late adolescence, where the push to adulthood and a more fixed identity presses upon the adolescent and the adolescent's body most keenly. The body and the body's surfaces offering one after another failed solution in the form of endless opportunities and possibilities for makeovers. Tarrying in the liminal, then, as a response to ideological changes in the social bond, offers a better option for some speaking beings who find refuge in the shapeless, undefinable, legitimately deferred identity of the adolescent. Questions about sex and death, identity and independence, separation and attachment, therefore re-emerge foregrounded almost as phobic constructions when it seems that the time has finally come to cut free of the liminal. Insofar as they do, and insofar as they are articulated in the course of a psychoanalysis, a reconnection with the symbolic may be established, allowing for that adolescent to leave the liminal and its apparent discontents behind. So, as a kind of elaboration of what I've just been saying, I'm going to talk now about another couple of clinical, just a couple of clinical vignettes. And my heading, and I'm not going to sing it, but what I really want to know is, should I stay or should I go? An 18-year-old girl came to see me. Coming of age legally, she explained, was only of limited value, since now she is legally an adult, her fears of dying and of growing up, in that order, can no longer be put out of her mind. Throughout her teens, she enjoyed school, friendships, family. She was head girl, an athlete, popular, good, and, she added ultimately, had managed to avoid deciding upon a sexual orientation. I asked her to tell me everything she could about her fear of dying. She told me that her maternal grandfather died when she was 6 years old, and although she didn't remember him or it, the event, all that well, she remembered how devastated her mother was when he died. So, the one who suffers when there is a death in that family is her mother. What will happen to her mother when this girl dies, or if she grows up? The timing of her appointment is then a relevant rehearsal of her loss to her mother. The fate, worse than death, actually, is to have to grow up. A tragic nostalgia is situated in the future anterior, leaving adolescence behind in order to enter the kingdom of adults, is also at the very same time to stage a loss, to rehearse her death as her mother's child. But it is also to mourn what has been a contented liminal existence and the self-permitted deferral on a decision about sexuality. For this girl is a lesbian, but at the moment unhappily so. She had thought that by 18 she might have straightened out. Return. How older adolescents in our time can imagine the loss they fantasize of bringing upon their parents, especially their perfect parents, when they finally leave adolescence behind, is woven into symptoms which speak to the repressed ambivalence around these perfect parents, as well as to what leaving parents behind will do to them. As tarrying in the liminal usually means living longer and longer with parents, there are often resurgences of older, unresolved intrusion and or Oedipus complexes in the form of complaints of rivalry and envy between siblings, and expressions of tensions of ambivalence with one or other parent or both. Parents now loom awkwardly as just bigger people they have to share a house with, whose habits they have no control over, and they have no say in how they live. Long after most children and young adolescents have overheard or even actively listened out for the sexual encounters of their parents, late-stage adolescents are incapable of retaining the necessary distance, psychical, physical, we could say geographical, which allows them to put their parents' active sex lives out of their minds. One such 26-year-old girl is struggling to leave home. The COVID-19 pandemic served to externally justify her dallying, her tarrying at home. The middle child of a family, her older brother died when she was very young, and her younger sister has already moved out with her boyfriend and another couple of friends. She, however, is left home alone with her parents, late 50-somethings, who like to have a few drinks at the weekend, stay up late, enjoy the TV with the volume turned up loud, and then have noisy middle-aged fun sex later on. The girl cannot manage to get to sleep before them and is woken up by them later on with their trips to the bathroom following their sexual adventures. Speaking about her parents' sexual relationship catches her in the grip of a horrified jouissance. Her dreams are full of torrid sex scenes which she is called upon to witness. The sessions are filled with what was unspeakable before. Why must she be the one who has to see and hear what should remain invisible and inaudible? But nothing is set at home about all of these things which keep her awake and disturbed, and nothing was ever said at home about the circumstances of her brother's untimely death. If her tarrying in the liminal, staying too long thanks to the pandemic, engages her in the painstaking unpicking of the inhibitions she fomented following the family symptom of not speaking about the real, then her exit will be the result of a working through, first, of the real of her brother's death, and second, of the real of the sexual relationship. Another client, a Norwegian girl, started a 3-year-long therapy with me when she was 23. She came with disordered eating and a jouissance conditioned on her inability to say no to herself, as the urge to binge eat overwhelmed her regularly. She left Norway to try to separate from her family, as living with them made her really unhappy and stuck in an endless discomfort eating cycle. Her mother and 2 older sisters had all had gastric band surgery to stop them from overeating, but for 2 out of those 3 women, it didn't work. It didn't put a stop to it. When she was growing up, her mother would stuff her and her sisters with food. They couldn't leave the table until they were completely full. Every celebration, any happy moment whatsoever, was an opportunity for cake and sweets. But she knew that her mother was unhappy, eating and drinking herself to sleep, and her sisters were overweight, depressed, lonely, and, as she put it, a bit strange. This girl has tried really hard to do things differently. First, a geographical separation, bringing about liminal suffering, neither feeling at home when she's back there, she has changed too much. Neither does she feel at home when she's in Ireland. She's still too foreign, too Norwegian, too much still her mother's daughter. 3 years of pushing all of this and more into words, finding strange new connections in her speech, she started to find it possible to tolerate the discomfort of a gap between the urge to fill it with food, her mother's symptom, and the sense of loss or emptiness of living differently, alone, her own symptom. Following a visit home in the 2nd year of the work with me, she was very excited to tell me about something that she found. Oh, she said I was going to find really interesting on her return. So she'd had a tattoo inked on her upper arm, 4 words from the Norwegian national anthem. Translated into English, they can be rendered as weathered, aged, over the water. This was the bit of her that was and is always Norwegian, an evocation of what she calls the motherland, reminding her of her mother and her sisters and the place where she grew up. But there's more to it than that. The tattoo is inked in a beautiful script, none other than her mother's own handwriting. So she'd had her mother write the words out, which she then brought to the tattoo artist, and he copied them out onto her arm. So, in this way, I think we can say that she carries her mother's handwritten message on her skin, but the message is of her own choosing. And these are the precise words that allow her to love her mother from afar, from over the water, and as such, it really does mark the end of a liminal phase in which she was held captive by her mother's desire and jouissance. Now, I know I'm trying to kind of intersperse the vignettes with some of the material that I'm bringing in, and I do hope that that's making sense for you. But I'm going to dive now into Lacan's note and kind of bring what he's saying there together with the work, the clinical work, and again, kind of paying attention to how the liminal comes into some of these, I would say, symptoms, but we can talk about what a symptom is later on as well. So, 2 notes on the liminal adolescent. First principle. Lacan's note on the child was, in fact, a very short note, a type of letter addressed to Jenny Aubrey containing 2 clinical insights. And typically speaking, Lacanian analysts working with children find this note of Lacan's to be a touchstone in their clinical work. And I find it useful in my work with adolescents and in my consideration of the ways the adolescent's body and liminal subjectivity are caught up with the real of the sexual couple and with maternal jouissance. So let us briefly recap. The first principle, according to Lacan, is that the child's symptom answers to what is symptomatic in the family structure, a situation that he describes as the fundamental fact of the analytic experience. In this regard, as he put it, the symptom represents the truth of the sexual couple. Applying this principle, this first principle of Lacan's clinical contribution to working psychoanalytically with young people, now we can say in the first quarter of the 21st century, we need to ask, of which sexual couple is the child or adolescent symptom the truth? Applying this question to my own clinic in Ireland, relatively new social facts resulting from the legislation of separation and divorce means that there is not just one sexual couple in an Irish familial structure any longer, but sometimes several. In addition, and as a consequence of the peculiar liminal spaces opening up in these new family forms, symptoms also arise as a meaningful response to stop the constant toing and froing between sets of parents, and even to sometimes try and prevent an ultimate separation. So a 13-year-old boy had lived with his separated parents at his paternal grandparents' home while his parents saved up enough money for 2 down payments for 2 separate new homes. As the time came for these new homes to be almost reaching, final, completion, where the sales were agreed, the boy developed a debilitating new symptom, and that's when he was brought to see me. And the debilitating new symptom was an urgency to urinate frequently. And he'd been brought to the doctor, and the doctor had given him the all clear that they'd done various tests and ruled out the usual things which are associated with the need to urinate frequently. But while the boy was telling me about this symptom and about how anxiety provoking it is, because obviously it would happen all day and he could be in school and need to go out to the bathroom several times in during one period, and would really even then work himself up into a frazzle thinking about what would happen, in the next class or in the sports class, and people are going to notice, and it became really something very phobic for him. But as he was telling me all of this, he would say that while he felt the need to go, he would be saying to himself, I have to go, I have to go, I have to go. Okay? And in this way, the boy embodied the urgent, imminent separation of the parents from each other and their imminent departure from the place that he knew as home for all of his life. This adolescent symptom expresses in the signifier and in his body the truth of the sexual relationship of his parents. They have to go. And in the going, there is a physical separation and an urgency now after all of the holding on. However, it isn't always clear that the adolescent has a symptom, even if he is a symptom for his parents. And obviously that can often be the raison d'etre for parents seeking out a form of therapy for their child or adolescent. Indeed, the symptom may very well often be sketched in the terms of an intolerance of liminality for a parent, in the form of he or she is changing. I don't know them anymore. I don't know who they are becoming. A 14-year-old boy was brought to see me because his mother thought he was addicted to porn. She had found it on his phone a few times, and she was disgusted by it and furious and disgusted with him. She and the boy's father have been apart since he was 5, and both parents have remarried. So now she and her new husband have 3 children under the age of 6, and the boy's father and his new wife have 1 child together who is 4. The boy lives for 4 days of 1 week with his mother, husband and children, and then the weekend with his dad, wife and daughter. And on the following week, he goes to his dad on a Wednesday and returns to his mum at the weekend. And I don't expect you to follow all that, but you can hear the complexity of it, right? He's been doing this for 8 years. In his mother's demand of me to get him unhooked from porn, I hear that she wants me to turn him into a child again. For when she expands upon things, in her words, he has become just like his father, tall as a house and uncommunicative. He comes to me for about 6 months. He very quickly establishes that I'm very interested in everything he has to say, and he likes to tell me about the details of every day in minute detail. How in the mornings he gets up and fixes his own and his little brother's lunchboxes for school, how he walks to school, who he chats to on the way to school, what subjects he has every day, how things are going with Ben and with Adam, his best school pals, how it's going with football training, which PlayStation game he plays after homework, who's involved in the game, what they chat about in their online conversations. And the best thing of all, his favorite TV shows. I'm told about the intricacies of each and every plot, which character is compelling, who's not really all that interesting, and so on. And all of this is told against the backdrop of who he is with that week, whether it's his mum or his dad. Now, with everything, he sees that I'm listening, I'm very engaged, and I manage to impress him with my memory of the characters and the plot developments. I understand how important it is for there to be a placeholder in the symbolic, which, regardless of whether he is with his mother or his father, with me, it's always Friday, and he is the only child in the room, and it really is all about him. And I never ask about porn, and once only does he mention it in reference to speaking about one of the rows he has had with his mother. He says he tried it, but he didn't like it all that much. During the time that I'm working with him, I have 3 sessions with the mother. Each time, she attends with her youngest child who is still breastfeeding, and on 2 of these occasions, she needs to nurse the baby who has started to fuss. So I see that she has her hands and her arms full of babies and little children, but it is necessary for her to bear and support her son's adolescence without alienating herself from him as she condenses onto him the figure of his father, no longer lovable to her. So this work involves creating a space with this adolescent to enthrall her once again. In fact, to recuperate something of the object that he once was for her, while at the same time allowing breathing space for change and growth, and to experience the inevitable liminality of his adolescence in ways that do not repulse his mother. Second principle. Lacan's second principle in his note concerns the child's symptom as stemming from the subjectivity of the mother. Lacan argues that the child is now concerned directly as the correlate of the mother's fantasy. In this way, and as he puts it, the child becomes the mother's object, and the child's symptom reveals the truth of this object. In other words, that she or he is in the position precisely of the objet of the mother's fantasy. And we can see how in the little vignette I just gave you, that child had dropped out of that place, of that object. 2 phenomenally rich elaborations for psychoanalysis with adolescents follow on the basis of this claim. First, this leaves the adolescent open to every kind of phantasmatic capture. So here's an example. An 18-year-old girl limped into my consulting room with her mother. She couldn't walk or bear to stand since she had hurt her back. But according to her doctors, she's cured. So what's happening? I was told it would be a brief treatment as the girl was due to travel at the end of the summer to take up her place at a really important dance school. And in the first session, the mother told me that she was willing to bend over backwards to help her daughter. In the second session, the girl told me that while she was rehearsing a piece on stage, a choreographer asked her to do a backbend. And the girl thought to herself, that's a little bit risky, but she went ahead and she did it. So, okay, a week later, she has to do an audition. And again, the thought crosses her mind, well, I hurt my back. Maybe the best thing to do is not do the audition right now. But her mother had insisted on it, so she did it. Using this signifier, which is actually the signifier that the mother introduces into the session, we can see that actually it's the girl who bends over backwards. And she bends over backwards for want of abdicating the place that she has in her mother's fantasy. The second point of Lacan's claim is that as objet A in the mother's fantasy, the child alienates all possible access by the mother to her own truth. So as Lacan put it at the time, the child gives the mother's truth, body, existence, and even the requirement of protection. This is really rich. So the child's symptom stems from the mother's unmediated desire and, as embodied, takes on, let's say, a reality which the mother will fight to protect, since the child's symptom comes to occupy the psychic space of the mother's raison d'etre. So I worked with a 17-year-old girl whose mother had become attached to her anorexia, and specifically to her anorexic body as the body of a loving child. During the first meeting, the mother complained to me that her 17-year-old daughter had changed and was rude and out of control. These things are not really symptoms, and they're not really necessarily something which you get brought to therapy for. Certainly, I don't work with people to change them from being rude to being polite. So, what was the real problem? The mother decided that actually, no, you know what? The girl is still sick, but she doesn't realize that she's sick, but she is still sick. Now, the girl, I could see, she was saying, no, I'm fine. So I asked the mother to say a little bit more, and she said, look, in the end, she feels that she really knows her daughter, and having nursed her through the anorexia and accompanied her to all of the hospitalizations and the doctors and everything else, that she really feels that she knows the girl and knows her eating disorder really, really well, and better than the girl herself. Running out of steam somewhat, she then said, well, look, I just want my little girl back. The signifier, little, exploded into the room. The girl then had the chance to say something, which was along the lines of, look, it's interesting that you say little, right? Because I was little when I was anorexic. And I think that you preferred me then. And that was the perfect intervention, because actually I couldn't have done it better myself. She was more livable when she was sick. But of course, the mother doesn't want her to be sick. But she wants her little girl back. So at this point, and I'm coming to you'll be glad to know, coming to an end. At this point, we can bring in a later element from Lacan's work and connect it up to this second note on the child. This is like the missing piece. In his 20th seminar, Encore, and within the context of his remarks on the impossibility of sexual rapport, Lacan says that since a woman's jouissance is not all phallic, not all conditioned by the sexual relationship, she finds a way to stop up or cork this other jouissance, which he says makes her absent from herself as subject, with the objet constituted by her child. So, on the one hand, a symptom is the mobilization of the mother's unmediated desire in the child. On the other hand, the fantasy agitates the mother's territorialization of the child's body as child, since the child embodies what is lacking to the mother. In other words, again, the child's body is fetishized for what it offers to the mother's fantasy, whereas the child's transformed and liminal body in adolescence threatens the loss of the objet for the mother. In some cases, the notion that the child's transforming body in adolescence poses a threat to the child acts to further impel a mother to protect her child from the world and from her, his, or their self. The territorialization of the young girl's anorexic body that I just spoke about by her mother functioned in order to keep her little and loving. But as she entered into adolescence, the mother's bearings came undone. To conclude, approaching the work with adolescents as the ones who live betwixt and between, we have to consider that they are also the ones who are redefining what lies betwixt and between, subjected as they and we all are to the prevailing discourses in our times, which posit reinvention, becoming, and change as totemic objects of jouissance. Whether diving into the liminal to escape the constraints of childhood, or tarrying there to compensate for lack in jouissance imagined as a condition of adulthood, for younger as well as for older adolescents, it is often their bodies which suffer. In my experience, I see that adolescents who have the chance and opportunity to work psychoanalytically can put in place a kind of delimiting function in the experience of the liminal. But this will be a delimiting resulting from an articulation of their own suffering as liminal. In the work, it means always allowing for the signifiers of the specific knotting of singularity with liminal to emerge in the sessions. Tracing, tracking, and paying that close attention to the signifiers so valued in our work is especially important here in order to avoid the banalizing of the singular experience, but the glossing of that experience on social media platforms and in pedagogic discourses. Insofar as these experiences may be explained to a psychoanalyst, I believe that a subjectivizing of the liminal may be mobilized. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Carol. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to start off with some questions I have for Carol, but as usual, if people have questions they want to ask, then please just raise your Zoom hand and we can unmute you and you can join in the conversation. Carol, that was absolutely fascinating. I was quite enraptured there. Lots going on, lots to think about. I wonder if I could start with asking a kind of more conceptual question, which was kind of coming back to me again and again as you're talking about how we define adolescence. And I really liked your use of this idea that the liminal in understanding adolescence. And the liminal to me is, liminal etymologically suggests the threshold, a space between, you move between two spaces, and the liminal being the space between. And I wonder, when we're thinking of adolescence, what are the other spaces that's on the other side of that liminality? And I guess really what I'm asking is, how do we sufficiently understand adolescence as something that isn't simply a threshold that extends forever? Do we ever exceed adolescence, or is there ever a point we stop being adolescents? Can we actually think of it as a demarcated period? In a former life, I was a school teacher, and I remember a colleague, this was many years ago, when my colleagues used to refer to the head teacher as a 50-year-old man pretending to be a 50-year-old man. And, do we ever grow up? And do we ever stop being adolescent?
Yeah, that's a funny question, Calum. Funny 10 questions. Do we ever grow up? Look, I mean, it's not so much that I think, that there's an imperative to grow up. And I hope, God, I really did not want to sound like I was saying, let's get these guys over the border and into adulthood because that's the great place to be. I think there is something really about the constructedness of this. And, I don't know what your gathering here consists of, whether you're psychoanalysts or students or, but I would hope that
we're a great mix.
Anyway, good, you're a mix. The thing is that, I think nowadays, to work psychoanalytically as a scholar or a clinician, I mean, we tend to be quite critically minded. So we trouble any kind of big, clunky, hegemonic sort of, I don't know, entities where we think, well, hang on now, there haven't always been adolescents, no more than there have always been children. Okay. So we can be very well aware that, adolescence is an invention. It's a term that's invented to describe something. I think that okay, I'm just slightly going off track, but the liminal is an interesting concept all by itself. Okay, because I think liminality is something that clearly we can experience in all sorts of times in our lives. I mean, however, there is something about what we let's say the way that adolescence is understood across disciplines, whether it's the psychosocial or, God forbid, the biological or the neurological, and there's a whole heap of awful stuff written about adolescence from these places and fields. Not to mention, the whole kind of developmental psychology, just the idea that, there's all of these phases and stages and they're all happening. But the thing is that like no other phase of liminality, so we can experience liminality during pregnancy, during, I don't know, we can say it during middle age, really, but probably during the menopause. There's a whole book waiting to be written about the liminality of the menopause, I'm sure. People nodding. So this is the thing, but there's something about what happens during adolescence where there is this sort of imperative acting in the symbolic on those people that we call adolescents. They know that they cannot call themselves an adolescent beyond a certain point. And, no more than our current Gen Z can call it, well, they will always be, that's interesting, actually. They will always be Gen Z by virtue of when they were born, right? Now, the new crowd is Generation Alpha. Your 12-year-old is Generation Alpha.
Is that? Yeah. He's very proud of being on the cusp between the two. Generation
Alpha. Oh, well, yeah, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I think could be alpha. But the point is that the adolescent is, can you say that you're a 50-year-old adolescent? No, I think that would be a strange thing to want to say, because it's not. We can talk about the child within, thanks to really odd, psychoanalytic discourses. But can we talk about the adolescent within? No, I don't think so. So it does, insofar as it comes to denote a certain time and comes, accompanied by all sorts of ideologies and prescriptions and prescriptions about behavior. I mean, you think about the age that a young person can vote, can marry, can take a drink, can have consensual sex. These are different in different societies across the world. So, insofar as all of these things are fungible and up for grabs and can change and can be rechanged, can change again, then I think that the whole term is troublesome. But it is troublesome more for those people who are actually in it than for anybody else, because they are the ones who, as I'm saying, they're the ones stuck with the betwixt and the between and what is expected of them. And actually, one of my current rants is about how, adolescents, are colonized. They were discovered, and now they can be treated and managed, and they can be sold things to because of their special needs. They, and really targeted quite viciously by, marketing campaigns on account of the characteristics which are said to be, adolescent characteristics on the one hand, but which are then used against them to sell them things, including an adolescent identity on the other hand. So it's very pernicious, and I've forgotten what the rest of your question was about, but anyway, there we are.
That point of identity, I think, is a really crucial one, in the sense that if we understand adolescence as a point where identities are are being tried on, are being shaped, and that seems to be quite a common understanding of adolescence. You're not quite sure who the you want to be is, so you try various different things. And in your experience, I think particularly your experience in the clinic, is that something very different now from the way it was 10, 20 years ago? I'm thinking particularly in the context that the identities available in terms of public discourse seem to have changed enormously in that time. I'm not saying identities were ever simple, but the public discourse in terms of what identities may be available seems to have exploded very, very recently, in a way that certainly in my experience seems to be quite confusing for a lot of adolescents, or at least a lot of adolescents I encounter.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that one of the things that really adds to the complexity of this whole question of identity is the speed at which you can reinvent, or even can be reinvented by somebody else. So it's the problem is that I mean, this is it's I suppose. It's something that we talk about in Lacanian circles, right? That there, things have changed. There's no name of the father functioning in the way that there once was. Now, there's quite a lot of Lacanian theorists who say, come on, that's rubbish. There never was a name of the father that functioned in the way that, it was supposed to function in terms of gathering things together and operating along, very clear-cut ego ideals. And however, when we talk kind of more like old school Lacan and name of the father, I mean, even Lacan, with his far-reaching, possibility to imagine almost the internet in his 17th, the summer of 17, where he's practically talking about iPhones, people saying, listen, the people are going to be talking to the stars and, having all sorts of things going on. But the thing is, though, is that he could not possibly have imagined or been able to foresee what the access to digital technology and the speed at which things move. So what happens, of course, is that a story which was floating around last week or yesterday is old news already. And for the adolescent who is in a state of flux and trying to, find some external point which guarantees something. And in this case, we can say, no, the name of the father doesn't exist like, I don't know, the BBC back in the day for people in the UK, or for us in Ireland, the Angelus that would come on at 6 o'clock, actually, I think it still does. But anyway, 6 o'clock, you'd have the bells of the Angelus. These are kind of names of the father in a certain way. You knew you could expect this at a certain time and only at that time. And it meant something very specific. Now, with the speed at which things go in terms of, how stories are renewed and repeated, like on Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok, young people are exposed to such a frightening phenomenon that nothing lingers, nothing lasts. And there's a whole lot of terminology which you've probably noticed, but like you can what I hear from young people, I can unadd, certainly you can unfollow, but did you know you can unadd? This is not a subtraction, it's an unadding. So I can unadd someone from my group chat, having added them before, I can now unadd them. Right? So even with the invention of these new terminologies, these new ways of describing activities in this very fastly moving, very, digitalized social bond or version of the social bond, nothing is stable and nothing is guaranteed any kind of shelf life. So I'm thinking of, is it Matthew Flissflider, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He's got this great expression where he says, the the ideology of social media works by objectivizing the subject rather than producing subjectivity. So it's, there's a constant, you're objectified, but that doesn't give you the opportunity to form an identity against or with either an ego ideal or, in some sort of specular way that you have ratified and this is you, go ahead. Or indeed with, your little set of ideal egos, because they can also change, because they can unadd you and unfollow you or have you unfollowed or blocked in the twinkle of an eye. That was not the twinkle of an eye. That was the click of my fingers, but there we are.
You paint a very vivid and quite scary picture.
Whoops, sorry.
It was interesting there in your answer to that last question. You brought in the father. In your talk, you spoke at some length, partly I think because Lacan does, about the mother, but you said very little about the father. And I think we can all grasp this idea of the child as the object pitié of the mother. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the father fits into that or doesn't fit into that. And again, I mean, going back to the point you were just making about the lack of the name of the father, the paternal function, and that sense we get talked about that, there's a failure of masculinity and therefore a failure of the father position. Is that something that you see in the clinic, or is that, is that just talk? Is that just media talk?
I mean, it's the thing is, yes, I would see it, but I see other things too. So, and I'm sure this is the case with, if there's anybody there who works with young people, you don't just see one thing. I guess the examples or the vignettes that I chose to speak about, were connected more with this idea of trying to, illustrate what these two notes or these two principles could possibly mean. However, I mean, there is something about, like, I don't want to reproduce a kind of essentialism around mothers. There's, we need to think about, yes, maternal jouissance, but, not all mothers are women. So, like, I don't want to confuse people altogether, but I really think that this applies to the person who is doing the mothering, the person who is there in that position. And it's not always a woman. So I think that that's important to say, first of all. I would see, and bear in mind, like, I would see, gay and lesbian couples where there's two mummies and two daddies. So, but there's still some maternal jouissance going on, but it's not in both, Well, actually, sometimes it is in both, but most usually it's in one or the other. They take turns. But look, the thing is, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit giddy. The dog is knocking on my door here, which is a little bit distracting. Let me go back to this business about the father. I don't want to descend into, a complete sort of sociology of the clinic, because that's the problem when we say, do you see a lot of, or is there any sense in which the father comes into this? I could say, well, maybe not, but maybe that's only because I myself haven't encountered, let's say, a good old fashioned, paternal function coming in and telling me what's what. But quite often what happens is that there can be a situation where parents will come in together with their young person, and the way that a father speaks, and sometimes this is a man, the way a father speaks in the room is different to the way that the mother speaks about the young person. So, and that's where, like, really I will bring it all in, kind of thing, because I will make sure that both parents speak, because I need to hear, what are the signifiers being used to talk about this child by both parents if they're both present. And just an example jumped into mind, which was of a boy who was extremely anxious, and they have, well, the old symptom, which was called school refusal. I think it's called school aversion now, which is probably appropriate, really. I think, for a lot of people. But anyway, the school refusal. So he wasn't going in, didn't want to go to school, couldn't stand it. He'd get into school, feel really anxious, need to come home. And his mum was, like, what can you do? What can we do? Is there a way? Like, are there things we can do at home to help him want to go into school and stay at school? And I don't engage with those kind of questions. I was just like, look, I want to hear more about the anxiety, when it started, and what are the sort of precise things that he worries about. And I'm talking to the kid, the young person's, I'm making eye contact with him while I'm talking to the parents. But suddenly the mum says, oh, well, his dad is a worrier. His dad's always been worrying and always really anxious, haven't you? You're always really anxious, aren't you? And the dad then spoke, and he said, well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I've been anxious all my life. Yeah, I was anxious as a child, and now I'm seeing the young lad's eyes nearly popping out of their sockets, because he hasn't heard this before. He didn't know this about his dad, that he was always worried, that he was always anxious. And so I said to the dad, so what did you do? How do you manage your anxiety? And he said, oh, nothing. I don't do anything about it. Nothing. I just get on with it. And then the mother said, okay, well, maybe that's got something to do with why our child is having so much trouble. So actually, how a father enters into the treatment is always significant. And I don't just mean in terms of, let's say, a stereotypical paternal function, in some way making more clear what the mother's desire is, naming and delimiting maternal jouissance. But sometimes it's to offer something into the room, which is of the symbolic father. That's the important thing, because you can have as many fathers as you like. And I don't know that I would agree really on the whole business of, the failure of masculinity, or the disappearance of masculinity, or these, what is it, father deserts or man deserts. But I do think that there's something about what kinds of fathers, can be permitted, if you like, in parenting. And that, I think, is a big issue, because, how are we supposed to learn? Where are men supposed to learn how to be the kind of parents that are useful to the kind of adolescents who are suffering in the ways that we know that they are?
And possibly through a more generalized motherhood, which
Yeah,
is a really interesting way of looking at it. The mother doesn't have to be the female partner, or it doesn't always have to be the female partner.
No, indeed. I wouldn't. I mean, surely, I know that you must think that. I mean, you couldn't possibly not think that, right?
No, I agree. I think the way you put it was really, really neat. I hadn't really thought of it in such well-articulated terms.
Oh, thank you. Anyway.
Which, I mean, talking of well-articulated, I also, the way you talked about the child as the object pitié of the mother, I thought was also very, very powerful. And you really brought out the sense of burden that entails as well, because I think we often conceive of, you see this in Lacan, you see people write about it, it's all very theoretical, but the way you spoke about it, you really, how awful in a way, how wonderful and how awful to be.
Totally. Yeah.
Very powerful.
No, it's thank you for saying that, because it's really heartbreaking, it's very, when you read Lacan, you go, oh my God, these dreadful mothers, what are they doing to their poor kids? But no, it's not like that. There's tragedy, there's real tragedy and sorrow. It's not, and it's important, I think, to hear that, the burden, as you say, but the pathos and the ambivalence, like the woman I talked about, who's, she can't see her boy, he's grown up and he's horrible now, so he's into porn. Don't like him anymore, but he's not. He's, still adorable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've got loads more questions for you, but I'm being selfish and I'm going to open it up to other people. So, Mark, I see your hand up there.
Yes, hello, both of you and everyone else. I really value your work, Carol, and also the stories you were conveying, and your willingness to see the bigger picture of what's happened to the fatherhood or motherhood in our time. And I'm wondering about the omnipresence of screens for many children and adolescents, and whether you see that as a kind of extended mirror stage, or, redoubling, tripling, quadrupling of the imaginary in positive or negative ways. There's a lot of discourse here in the US about not giving kids cell phones until they're 16 because of so many pressures, especially on young women.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Mark. Thank you, and thanks for your comments. Really sweet. It's a big thing at the moment. I was in the UK last week, and I see that your Prime Minister is also promising to bring in all sorts of vetoes, or I don't know what he's trying to do. But anyway, the same thing about just maybe restricting use of screens until they're a certain age. I cannot imagine how such a thing could be enforced, first of all. So this is interesting. I remember years ago, Adam Phillips came to Dublin, and I honestly can't remember what he was talking about now, but he was great, very entertaining. But somebody asked him the same question, and he said, no, it's not a problem. The screens is not a problem, so long as there's everything else is going on anyway. Right. In other words, so long as, there is conversation, so long as there are board games, really banal things. OK, we can forget about it. There's no point even thinking about, vetoing or banning them or censoring them. We all know what happens when we try to restrict or prohibit. We know what happens. Right. But you're right. What we have to try to do is understand them. And I think, people have only just started to try to do that. And oh my God, I know so many people. I know Calum does too, writing books and articles, great books, great articles on, how they're kind of thinking and understanding digital technology and just, the whole social media thing. Not just social media, but like even when I was talking about, children can interact, young people can interact with others on games as well. So it's not just, the phone, the iPhone, or the tablet. Your question about the multiplication of the mirror stage, I'm not sure about that. As in, no, I actually think it doesn't. I think the mirror stage, it performs a particular function and an essential function. And, as a pathway, well, certainly as a pathway to the formation of the ego, but also to a relationship with the specular image. That first moment in the mirror stage is, there's a second moment, which is the ratification of that image by the ego ideal. And that doesn't happen with the iPhone. That doesn't happen with, the images on the iPhone. There's no amount of repetition of the image which sanctions or ratifies the image in the same way that, let's say, the big other does, the ego ideal. Okay. Now, but at the same time, and I think that this is where you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head. It complexifies the imaginary. That's the thing. It introduces problems and dilemmas in the imaginary that it's very difficult for us to keep abreast of, because unless we're actually using it in the same way, it means that we have to try and hypothesize or speculate. So even if any of you here, you have, children or adolescents or teenagers, you yourself already are too old and too past it in the way that you use your devices. I'm sorry, God, maybe some of you are only 18, but this is it. Like, you're not, you will never have the relationship with your device that your 12-year-old, your 16-year-old, your 18-year-old will have. It is actually a relationship, but it's not a relationship. So this is the relationship actually that Lacan, imagined back in 7 or 17. It's precisely the relationship with an object which doesn't belong at all to any desire. It's a kind of it's outside of any libidinal or libidinalized relationship. So for that reason, I think, you're right to be worried. I think we don't know yet about what the ultimate effects will be on this generation and younger generations of this, the frequency of the image and the repetition of the image. Well, we can't imagine it. We literally can't imagine it. But as a stupid anecdote, maybe, I for years was going around saying I couldn't care less about an iPhone. I have no interest in my iPhone. I look, it's just a device, and I just use it, and it's a machine. And then I lost it. And for the first few days, I was like, yeah, look, whatever, I'll replace it. And then my husband said, so did you back up all your photos and your videos and everything? And I was like, what do you mean, did I back up my photos and my videos? What? I hadn't. And then I realized that I had lost all of this lovely stuff, this great content, as they say these days. And I was devastated, and I was so sad. And then I went through a whole other week of feeling really, really sad, because I realized that the iPhone that I had was gorgeous. It was lovely. I had lost it. And I was in agony for about 3 weeks, inconsolable. And then I found it. It was in my car, which, anyway, that says a lot about me. But the thing is that we do, in fact, form a relationship with these weird things, but they're not the same relationship that we have with an other, a small other, or a big other.
Thank you for that story, too, because it reminds me of, I teach university level, and it reminds me how difficult some of my students become when I say, just put away your cell phone or even your laptop for the time being, so we can be present to each other. And it's a theater class, theater history, but these are theater majors, and they are still so attached to that device. So I agree with you. There's something different about their generation that way. And also going through COVID and learning, through devices only for several years.
I know, totally. And I think that's the thing about Gen Z, are the first generation who have never not. They're called digital natives. They have never not known, digital technology.
Different world.
Yeah, different world.
Carol, we've got to 9:30, which is our finishing time. There's loads more to say, loads more to talk about. Carol, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and an even more fantastic conversation afterwards. It's been great to talk, and I look forward to doing it in reality soon without the digital devices. For everyone else, this is it for Lacan in Scotland for this academic year. As I said at the beginning, we will be back in September. We will put as much of the New Year's schedule up on the website as we can, as soon as we can. Was just finalizing that over the next few weeks. But we've already got some really good names for next year. So if you've not, I see lots of familiar faces here, but if you haven't already signed up to our mailing list, then please do, and we'll keep you abreast of what's happening. In the meantime, thank you for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful summer.
Thank you. Bye.